Sometimes, the quietest nights leave behind the loudest memories. Maybe that's why you're here tonight. Welcome to Sleepy Shadows, where every story is told softly enough to help you rest, yet strange enough to stay with you. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? What time is it there? And is it a quiet night, or can you hear the rain outside? Now, get comfortable, and let's disappear into tonight's stories. I worked at a place where we used forklifts and large shipping containers, and I was the boss at the time. Most days the job was pretty routine. There were forklifts moving around, people working, and the usual things you would expect in a workplace like that. You got used to having to pay attention to what was happening around you because there was heavy equipment involved. Even when everything seemed normal, there was always the possibility that someone could get hurt if they stopped paying attention for even a moment. One day, I was there when a guy was operating a forklift. He wasn't paying attention, and he had his arm resting on the bar behind him while he was backing up. I remember seeing what happened, but it happened so quickly that there wasn't really any time to process it. He backed the forklift up directly into a container. The impact almost completely severed his arm. There was only a small flap of skin holding it on. For a second, I don't think anyone could really understand what they were looking at. It was the kind of injury that is so severe that your brain almost doesn't want to accept what your eyes are telling you. This wasn't a normal workplace injury. His arm was almost completely severed, and there was blood everywhere. He ran into the building. He was spurting blood all over as he came inside, and I ran over to him. At that point, there wasn't any time to stand there and think about how bad the injury looked. I had to stop him and get him somewhere where I could try to control the bleeding. I sat him down and got one of the other guys to get me some things so I could make an improvised tourniquet. I was trying to stay focused on what needed to be done. The situation was horrible, but there was still a job that had to be done immediately. He was losing a lot of blood, and I needed to slow it down until help arrived. I held his severed arm under mine. I had to squeeze his upper arm to slow the flow of blood while I worked on getting the tourniquet into place. There was nothing clean or controlled about it. I was using what I had available and trying to keep the bleeding under control. All the while, I was getting covered in his blood. It wasn't just on my hands. I was getting blood all over myself, from head to toe. I remember the sheer amount of it and how completely covered I became while trying to help him. At that point, I wasn't thinking about my clothes or what I looked like. I wasn't thinking about how difficult it would be to clean up afterward. I was focused on getting the bleeding stopped and keeping him alive until the paramedics arrived. Eventually, I managed to get the tourniquet on. I tightened it and finally got the bleeding under control. Once I had it stopped, I sat there with him and tried to keep him calm while we waited for the paramedics. That part is difficult to describe because after everything that had just happened, there was suddenly nothing else I could do except wait. The injury was already there. His arm was severely damaged. I had done what I could to control the bleeding, and now we were waiting for the people who could actually take over and treat him. So I stayed with him. I tried to keep him calm while the paramedics were on their way. Eventually they arrived and took over. The paramedics began handling the situation, and the immediate responsibility was no longer mine. Firemen had also arrived with them, and after the paramedics took over, I realized just how much blood was covering me. I asked the firemen if they could blast me off with the fire hose. At that point, I was covered in his blood from head to toe, and there wasn't really any other way I was going to get it all off. They did it. They blasted the blood off me with the fire hose. It got the blood off, but it didn't save my clothes. My clothes were ruined. After everything was under control, I sat outside until I dried. Then, I went home. I showered well and threw away the clothes that were stained with blood. I remember that even after showering, changing clothes, and trying to clean myself up, the experience wasn't something I could simply put behind me. I went back to work afterward. There was still work to do, and I went back to help the crew clean up the blood that had been left behind. We also had to throw away the chair he had been sitting in. That was another strange part of the whole experience. The accident itself had happened so quickly. Then there was the emergency response. The blood, the paramedics, getting hosed off, going home, showering, changing clothes, and then coming back. And when I came back, there was still the cleanup. We had to clean up the blood and get rid of the chair. I had already been covered in his blood earlier, but even after washing myself and changing, there was still something from the accident that stayed with me. I could taste his blood for the rest of the day. It was an awful thing to realize. I could actually taste it. Some of it had even gotten up my nose. At the time, I hadn't noticed that part. There had been too much happening, and I had been focused on stopping the bleeding and keeping him calm. It wasn't until later that I realized just how much of his blood had gotten on me. I didn't notice something else until I went home again. My mustache and goatee were stained with his blood. I hadn't realized it while I was at work. After everything that had happened, after getting covered in blood and then getting blasted off with the fire hose, after going home and showering and changing, I still had blood in my facial hair. I had to shave clean. That detail stayed with me because it showed just how much blood there had actually been. It wasn't something that had just gotten on my clothes or my hands. It had gotten everywhere, and I had been right there in the middle of it, holding his arm against me and squeezing his upper arm to slow the bleeding. The part that makes the whole thing even harder to think about is knowing what happened to him afterward. They were able to reattach his arm. So, despite how severe the injury had been, they were able to surgically reattach it, but it never worked right again. He didn't get his arm back in the sense of having it function normally. The injury had changed things permanently. Afterward, he went on permanent disability. That's what ultimately came from the accident. He had been operating a forklift, backing up while his arm was resting on the bar behind him. He backed into a container, and in an instant, his arm was almost completely severed. I was the person who happened to be there when he came running into the building. I was the person who sat him down. I was the person who had to hold his severed arm under my own arm and squeeze his upper arm to slow the bleeding. I was the person who had to get an improvised tourniquet onto him and keep him calm until the paramedics arrived. And for the rest of that day, I carried the memory of it with me. I could taste his blood. It had gotten up my nose. I had been covered in it from head to toe. The firemen had to blast it off me with a fire hose. My clothes had to be thrown away. Even after I showered, changed, and went back to work, I still had to help clean his blood from the workplace and throw away the chair he had been sitting in. And when I went home again, I discovered that his blood was still stained into my mustache and goatee. I had to shave them off. The accident itself lasted only moments, but dealing with what happened afterward took the rest of the day, and the consequences lasted much longer. His arm was reattached, but it never worked right again. He eventually went on permanent disability. That's what happened. There wasn't some explanation that made it easier to understand, and there wasn't a way to undo what had happened. One moment, he was backing up a forklift without paying enough attention, with his arm resting on the bar behind him. Then he backed into a container, and everything changed. I was sitting in my office one day when I saw two of the product line supervisors suddenly sprint past. They were moving fast enough that it immediately caught my attention. I didn't know what was happening, but seeing two supervisors running toward the production floor wasn't normal. Whatever had happened, it was serious enough that they weren't stopping to explain anything. It turned out that a mechanic had been working on a machine that had become jammed. He had tried to get the machine unjammed, but he hadn't turned the machine off before reaching into it. That decision changed everything. He reached into the machine, and while his arm was inside, the machine indexed. It caught his arm. Then it indexed again. The second movement partially ripped his arm off. I wasn't initially there when it happened, but I was soon called on to assist because I was a member of the safety committee and had been trained in first aid. The plant nurse and the safety director were also involved, and I was called in to help them deal with the situation. I knew, in theory, what I was supposed to do in an emergency. Being trained in first aid is one thing. Actually walking into a situation like that is completely different. I remember thinking that I was going to pass out. The guy was lying on his back, and when I saw what was left of his arm, it was difficult to process what I was looking at. There were shards of bone and tissue where his arm should have been. It wasn't the kind of injury that looked like something you could simply bandage and move on from. It was severe enough that my first reaction was almost physical. I felt like I might lose consciousness. I had seen injuries before, and I had been trained to respond to emergencies, but training doesn't prepare you for every possible sight. This was a person lying on his back in front of me with a devastating injury caused by a machine he had been trying to unjam. The fact that it had happened because the machine hadn't been turned off made it even harder to take in. He had reached into the machine while it was still capable of moving. Then it indexed. His arm was caught, and then it indexed again. That second movement caused the damage I was looking at. I remember trying to take in what I was seeing, while also knowing that I couldn't simply stand there staring at it. I had been called there because I was on the safety committee and had first aid training. The plant nurse and safety director were there too, and the situation required people to focus on the injured man rather than on their own reactions. But I was struggling with my own reaction. I thought I was going to pass out. That's one of the things I remember most clearly. It wasn't just that the injury was bad, it was seeing the physical result of what the machine had done to him. He was lying on his back, and what remained of his arm was essentially shards of bone and tissue. There is something about seeing an injury like that in person that is difficult to describe. You can know intellectually what a severe industrial accident looks like, but knowing it and actually seeing it are two completely different things. I was trained in first aid. I was part of the safety committee. I understood that there were procedures and that people had to respond. None of that changed what I saw when I looked at him. The image was simply there, and I knew I would remember it. For me, the hardest part was probably the contrast between the ordinary nature of the workplace and the severity of what had suddenly happened. This was a manufacturing facility. People worked there every day. Machines ran. Mechanics worked on equipment. Product line supervisors went about their jobs. I had been sitting in my office doing my own work. Then, two supervisors sprinted past my office toward the production floor. A few moments later, I was being called to assist with a man who had been caught in a machine. It was a completely different situation from the ordinary workday I had been having before that. The mechanic had only been trying to get a machine unjammed, but he hadn't turned it off. He reached inside. The machine indexed. It caught his arm. Then it indexed again, and that second movement partially ripped the arm off. That's the sequence I remember. There wasn't some complicated chain of events that led to it. It was a simple mistake with a terrible consequence. He reached into a machine that hadn't been turned off. The machine moved, and he was caught in it. When I saw him lying there, the reality of that consequence was right in front of me. I remember looking at what was left of his arm and thinking that I was going to pass out. It is difficult to explain the feeling because there isn't really a dramatic thought attached to it. It was more immediate than that. My body was reacting to what I was seeing. I had to fight through that reaction. Being trained in first aid doesn't mean you're immune to shock. It doesn't mean you can't be disturbed by something. It just means that when something happens, you have some understanding of what needs to be done and why your attention needs to stay on the injured person. I was there to assist the plant nurse and safety director. That was my role. But the image itself is something I have never forgotten. The man's position on his back, the condition of his arm, the shards of bone and tissue, the fact that this had happened because a machine had indexed while he was reaching into it. Those details stayed with me. I think that's one of the things people don't always understand about serious workplace accidents. You can leave the scene, go back to your normal routine, and still carry the image of what you saw with you. For me, it was that image of him lying on his back. I can still remember it. I can still remember seeing what was left of his arm. I can still remember the immediate thought that I might pass out. And I can still remember knowing that despite how badly I was reacting internally, I had to remain there and assist. The accident itself was over quickly, but the sight of the injury made it feel like time had stopped for a moment. Everything that had been ordinary before that was suddenly irrelevant. The production floor wasn't just a workplace anymore. There was a seriously injured man lying there, and everyone involved had to deal with what had happened. The fact that I had been on the safety committee also meant that I had some understanding of how important safety procedures were. Turning off a machine before reaching into it isn't just a technicality. It's the kind of thing that exists for exactly this reason. But seeing the consequence firsthand gave that rule a meaning that was impossible to forget. The mechanic had tried to get the machine unjammed. He reached in without turning it off. The machine indexed. His arm was caught. It indexed again. And his arm was partially ripped off. There was no way to look at that and think of machine safety as something abstract anymore. I had seen what could happen when a machine was allowed to move while someone was reaching inside it, and I had seen it from only a few feet away. I don't remember every detail of the response, and I don't want to add details that weren't part of what I actually experienced. What I remember is the part that stayed with me. I remember being called to assist the plant nurse and safety director because of my first aid training. I remember seeing the man lying on his back. I remember looking at his arm. I remember the shards of bone and tissue. And I remember feeling like I was going to pass out. That image has never really left me. Even now, when I think about that day, I don't think first about the office where I had been sitting. I don't think about the routine work I had been doing. I think about those two product line supervisors running past my office toward the production floor. I think about why they were running. And then I think about what I saw when I was called in to help. A mechanic had been trying to unjam a machine. He hadn't turned it off. He reached inside. The machine indexed and caught his arm. Then it indexed again. And by the time I saw him, what was left of his arm was shards of bone and tissue. I had been trained to help in emergencies, and I was part of the safety committee. So I did what I could, but I also remember how close I felt to passing out. Some things stay with you because they're frightening. Others stay with you because they're so real that your mind has trouble putting them anywhere else. For me, this was one of those things. I'll never forget it. I worked at a small college years ago, and there were a couple of things that happened there that I've never really forgotten. The first was by far the worst. One day, a woman who worked in financial aid was at work when her estranged boyfriend came onto campus. I don't remember all the details of their relationship, but I do remember that they were estranged, and somehow he was able to come into the college. He found her. What happened next took place right in front of her coworkers and several students. He stabbed her to death. There were people there who witnessed it, including students who had no reason to expect that anything like that was about to happen. It wasn't some distant incident that people only heard about afterward. They were right there when it happened. Campus police were able to arrest him, but they didn't get there in time to help her. That's one of the things that made the whole situation so difficult to process. A college is supposed to be a relatively ordinary place. People go there to work, attend classes, meet with professors, deal with financial aid, and take care of all the normal things that happen on a campus. Then, something like that happens. A woman comes to work, and an estranged boyfriend comes onto campus and kills her in front of the people around her. The students who witnessed it had to see something that most people would never expect to encounter at a college. Her coworkers had to see it happen to someone they worked with, and the campus police arrived, but not soon enough to save her. I don't remember every detail from that day, and I don't want to invent anything that wasn't part of what happened. What I remember is the fact that she was killed at work in front of her coworkers and several students, and that the man responsible was eventually arrested by campus police. That was enough. It was the kind of thing that changed the way people looked at the campus afterward. For me, it was difficult to reconcile the place I knew with what had happened there. It was a small college. It wasn't somewhere I would have expected something like that to happen. But it did, and everyone who was there had to live with the memory of it. There was another incident at the college that wasn't nearly as violent, but it was still disturbing in its own way. A professor who was healthy and only 40 years old suddenly died of a heart attack while he was in a meeting with a student. As far as anyone knew, he was healthy. He was 40. He was simply having a meeting with a student when he suddenly died. That incident shook the student up pretty badly. I can understand why. Even though it wasn't anything like the first incident, there is something deeply unsettling about watching someone who appears healthy suddenly collapse and die right in front of you. The student had been there for a meeting with a professor. It was presumably an ordinary meeting, the kind of thing that happens constantly at a college. Then the professor had a heart attack and died. There was no expectation that anything like that was going to happen. Nobody was. And afterward, the student had to deal with having been there when it happened. That was probably what made the second incident stick with me. It wasn't as bad as the first one, obviously, but it was still a reminder that terrible things can happen in places where people feel completely safe. The first incident was violent and deliberate. The second was sudden and completely unexpected. But both involved people who had simply been going about their normal day. The woman in financial aid had been at work. The professor had been meeting with a student. Neither situation was supposed to become something anyone would remember for the rest of their lives. But they did. The first incident especially was something that was difficult to forget because of how many people witnessed it. Her coworkers saw it. Several students saw it. Campus police eventually arrested the man responsible, but they weren't there in time to help her. That fact stayed with people. The second incident was different, but it carried its own kind of shock. A healthy 40-year-old professor died during a meeting with a student. There was no violence. There was no attacker. There was simply a sudden heart attack, and a person who was supposed to be sitting there having a normal meeting was suddenly gone. The student was understandably shaken badly by it. I think that's what stayed with me about working at that college. You could walk into work expecting an ordinary day and have something happen, that completely changed the way you thought about the place. The first incident showed how quickly a normal workplace could become the scene of something horrific. The second showed how quickly an ordinary meeting could become a life-changing experience for the person sitting across the desk. They were very different events. One was an act of violence, the other was a medical emergency. But both happened in the same kind of environment where people normally expected nothing more serious than classes, meetings, paperwork, and everyday college problems. That's probably why I still remember them. I worked at that college years ago, and those are two of the things that stand out when I think back on the place. A woman in financial aid was stabbed to death by her estranged boyfriend in front of her coworkers and several students. Campus police arrested him, but they didn't arrive in time to help her. And later, a healthy 40-year-old professor died of a heart attack while meeting with a student. The first was by far the worst of the two. The second wasn't as bad, but it still shook the student badly. Those are the kinds of things that don't really fit with the picture people normally have of a small college. But they happened. And once you've seen or experienced something like that at your workplace, it's difficult to look at that place in quite the same way again. I worked at a construction site years ago, and it reminded me of something that happened to my husband's cousin while they were having a house built. They were in the process of building the house, and because it was a construction site, there was a work-safe safety employee whose job was to make sure all the proper safety precautions were being followed. The irony of what happened is that the safety employee himself was the one who died. He showed up at the construction site one day when nobody was there. Since no one was there, he shouldn't have entered the site in the first place. But he went in anyway. He didn't sign in. He didn't have anyone there with him. And he wasn't wearing the kind of safety equipment you would expect someone in his position to be wearing. No hard hat, no safety gear, nothing. He climbed up a ladder that he had put up himself. And then something went wrong. Either the ladder slipped or he slipped, and he fell headfirst onto the concrete pad below. He died from the fall. The whole thing was completely preventable. That's what makes the story so disturbing. This was a person whose actual job was to make sure other people were following proper safety procedures. He was supposed to be the person checking that a construction site was safe. But he entered the site when nobody was there, didn't sign in, climbed a ladder he had put up himself, and wasn't wearing basic safety equipment. Then he fell headfirst onto the concrete and died. It was essentially a fatal accident caused by the very kind of safety violations he was supposed to be preventing. I can understand why that would stay with the family. They were building their home. It was supposed to be a place where they would eventually live and raise their family, not somewhere they would associate with a death. But someone had died there. And it wasn't just any accident. It was the safety employee who had come to inspect the site. The circumstances made it especially difficult to forget. There was also the fact that nobody else was there when he arrived. He should not have entered the site on his own. He went onto the property anyway, without signing in, and climbed the ladder he had put up himself. Then he fell. There wasn't anything anyone could do for him. He died there on the concrete pad. The family eventually decided to have the house blessed. After that, they continued with their lives and eventually moved forward with living in the house. They've been living there for something like 15 years now. The house itself became their home. Whatever feelings they had about what happened there, they didn't let the death prevent them from living there. They got the house blessed, and they continued to live there. 15-something years later, they are still there. I think the strange part of the story isn't that anything supernatural happened afterward. Nothing like that was mentioned. It's simply the circumstances surrounding the death that make the story so unsettling. A person whose job was to make sure construction workers followed safety rules ignored those same precautions himself. He entered a site when he shouldn't have. He didn't sign in. He wasn't wearing safety equipment. He climbed a ladder he had put up himself, and then he fell headfirst onto the concrete pad and died. It was completely preventable. The family had a house built there anyway. They had the house blessed, and they've continued living there for more than 15 years. For them, I imagine the place eventually became what it was always supposed to be, a home. But knowing how the story began, it's hard not to think about the person who died there whenever the circumstances come up. The irony is probably the hardest part to get past. The safety employee was there because safety was his job. He was supposed to make sure the proper precautions were being followed. Instead, he ignored them himself, and it cost him his life. That's the kind of story that stays with you, because there isn't really anything mysterious about what happened. There doesn't need to be. It was a tragic accident, and it was preventable. The house was eventually completed, the family had it blessed, and they continued living there. More than 15 years later, it's still their home. But the story of how that house came to have a death associated with it is something they probably won't ever forget. I worked at a place where someone once died during his shift after being electrocuted, and the thing that makes the story especially difficult to think about is how young he was. He was only 18. He was working his shift when he needed to use a floor buffer. To get it running, he went to plug it into an extension cord that was connected to an outlet on the wall. The extension cord was faulty. It had apparently been faulty for some time, but for whatever reason, it had never been replaced. He plugged the floor buffer into it. The moment he did, he was shocked. The electrical shock knocked him down, and he died. That's the part that has always stayed with me. He was only 18 years old. He wasn't doing anything unusual or reckless. He was simply doing his job and trying to plug a floor buffer into an extension cord that was already there for that purpose. The cord was faulty, and people apparently knew there was an issue with it, but it was never replaced. Then one night, an 18-year-old employee plugged the floor buffer into it. And that was it. He was electrocuted during his shift and died. There was security footage from that night, but because of the insurance situation and the potential lawsuits from his family over the faulty equipment, the footage was sealed. I never saw what was on it, and I don't want to pretend I know exactly what the footage showed. What I do know is that after what happened, the company completely changed the way they handled extension cords. They went crazy removing them. Every single extension cord they used was taken out. The same kind of equipment that had apparently been treated as something ordinary before suddenly became something the company wanted nothing to do with. It was a pretty extreme reaction, but after someone dies because of faulty electrical equipment, I can understand why. What makes the story so upsetting is that the death wasn't some unpredictable freak accident. The cord was faulty. It hadn't been replaced. And eventually, someone used it. That someone happened to be an 18-year-old kid who was just doing his job. He went to plug in a floor buffer. The faulty cord shocked him. He fell, and he died. Afterward, the company had to deal with the insurance issues and the possibility of a lawsuit from his family. The security footage was sealed because of those circumstances, so whatever was recorded that night remained something the company wasn't going to release. But the physical evidence of what had happened was harder to ignore. They removed every extension cord they used. They didn't just replace the particular cord that had caused the accident. They removed all of them. It was as if the company suddenly realized how much risk those cords represented and decided they couldn't trust any of them. I think that's what makes this story so disturbing. The cord had been faulty. For whatever reason, it hadn't been replaced. Maybe it had been considered a minor problem. Maybe someone had intended to replace it later. Whatever the reason was, it remained in use. And eventually, an 18-year-old employee was the person who paid for that decision with his life. He wasn't an electrician. He wasn't working on complicated electrical equipment. He was plugging in a floor buffer, something that should have been completely routine. Instead, the faulty extension cord turned an ordinary task into a fatal accident. Afterward, the company removed every extension cord they used. But that couldn't change what had already happened. An 18-year-old was dead. His family had lost him. The security footage was sealed, and everyone who worked there knew why the company had suddenly become so serious about getting rid of those cords. It was one of those workplace deaths where the thing that bothers you most isn't that nobody could have predicted it. It's that there was already something wrong. The cord was faulty. It should have been replaced. It wasn't. And eventually, someone plugged something into it. That was all it took. I don't know what was going through his mind in those final moments, and I don't want to invent anything about what he experienced. I only know that he was 18, he was working his shift, and he went to plug a floor buffer into an extension cord on the wall. The cord was faulty. The shock dropped him, and he died. After that, the company removed every extension cord they used. The security footage from that night was sealed because of the insurance and potential legal issues with his family. And the workplace continued on without him. That's probably the hardest part of stories like this. Everything around the person keeps going. The shifts continue. People come to work. Equipment gets used. Tasks get done. But one person who had been there is suddenly gone. And in this case, he was only 18. He should have had a lot more life ahead of him. Instead, an extension cord that should have been replaced became the last thing he ever touched at work. That's the part I remember most. Not some mysterious explanation, not anything supernatural. Just a faulty cord that was never replaced. An 18-year-old doing his job, and a company that only afterward went through and removed every extension cord they had. I worked at a small company with maybe 30 employees, and at the time I was in a director-level position. I had been working on a few different initiatives when I started hitting roadblocks that didn't really make sense. At the same time, I was becoming increasingly confused about our financial situation. The numbers weren't adding up. So I started digging into some of the figures myself. That was when I became a problem for the CEO. She realized I was looking closely at what was happening, and instead of explaining things or clearing up the inconsistencies, she tried to get me to go along with what she was doing. She had already brought the CFO and the VP of Growth, who was responsible for sales, into it as well. At that point, I still didn't know the full extent of what was happening. I knew something was seriously wrong. I knew she was doing things she shouldn't have been doing, and I was starting to understand that the company's financial situation was much worse than I had originally thought. What I didn't know was just how far it went. On top of the money she was stealing from the company, she was actually looking for outside investment to start a completely separate company that would compete directly with ours. Her plan was to deliberately destroy the company we were working for. She wanted to screw it up badly enough that it would eventually go under. Then she could take the money and walk away. And she offered me a piece of the new company. I was about 2 months away from the company going under when I finally figured out what was happening. A few days later, I told the founder and owner. I gave him my resignation letter and explained everything I had discovered. He was pretty shaken up. He had a decent relationship with the CEO, and looking back, He had given her far more trust than he should have. At that point, I was blowing the whistle because I believed she was deliberately trying to tank the company and manipulate the financial numbers. I had no idea that there was much more going on behind the scenes. I didn't know she had stolen around $2 million. I didn't know she was purchasing land in international locations as part of an attempt to launder the money. All of that came out during the following weeks, after the founder fired her and started digging into the company's finances himself. That's when the situation became completely insane. The weeks that followed were rough. After she was fired, she started stalking the business. She became increasingly unstable and started showing up at people's houses and making threats. It wasn't just a financial investigation anymore. Now people were dealing with someone who was apparently willing to show up at their homes and threaten them. At one point, she overdosed on pills and wine. She was revived in the back of an ambulance. Meanwhile, the investigation into the company was continuing. We had a team of FBI investigators in the office all day, every day. They were going through the books and examining the company's finances. Everyone was being interviewed. People were being asked questions about what they knew, what they had seen, and what had happened inside the company. The office had basically turned into the center of a massive investigation. It was insane, and somehow, that still wasn't the end of it. All of this was eventually capped off when we found out that her son had been arrested for rape. At that point, the whole situation had gone so far beyond anything I could have imagined when I first started looking into our financial figures that it was difficult to process. I had started by wondering why some numbers weren't making sense. I ended up uncovering an attempt to deliberately destroy the company. Millions of dollars in theft, international property purchases connected to laundering the money, threats against employees, an overdose, an FBI investigation, and then the arrest of her son. But there was another part of the story that mattered to me personally. I saved the company. Once the truth came out, we were able to pull the business out of the nosedive. The company started recovering. Eventually, we began posting profitable months for the first time ever. Had I not come forward, every single person working there would have lost their job. The company would have collapsed, and she probably would have gotten away with what she was doing. Instead, I came forward. The company survived, and I was promoted to running their operations. At the time, that felt like some kind of validation. I had taken an enormous personal risk by speaking up, but it had made a difference. People kept their jobs. The company survived, and I ended up being given more responsibility because of what I had done. But then, 6 months later, COVID hit, and that's where the story took another turn. The founder and CEO laid me off. He also took a PPP loan. He laid off 3 people, and I was one of them. The reason given was that we weren't revenue generators. After everything that had happened, that was difficult to swallow. I had spent months digging into the company's finances. I had discovered that the CEO was trying to deliberately destroy the company. I had come forward. I had told the founder what was happening. I had helped prevent the company from collapsing. The company recovered. We started posting profitable months for the first time. I was promoted to running operations, and 6 months later, I was one of 3 people laid off because I wasn't considered a revenue generator. Looking back, the whole experience became a pretty significant life lesson for me. There were things I learned from it that I don't think I could have learned any other way. At the time, I believed that if you saw something seriously wrong, you did the right thing. You came forward. You protected the people around you. You tried to prevent something terrible from happening. That's what I did. And objectively, it worked. I saved the company. I helped keep everyone else's jobs from disappearing. The company recovered from the situation and became profitable. But personally, It cost me. And after everything that happened, I sometimes wonder whether I should have handled it differently. In hindsight, I wish I had simply resigned and walked away. I wish I had removed myself from the situation, instead of getting involved in everything that followed. Because once I came forward, I wasn't just dealing with financial wrongdoing anymore. I was dealing with an investigation. I was being interviewed. The FBI was in the office every day. People were being threatened. The former CEO was showing up at people's houses. There was an overdose. There were investigations into millions of dollars. There were international property purchases. And there was the constant uncertainty of not knowing what was going to happen next. Eventually, the company survived. But I didn't walk away from it feeling like doing the right thing had been rewarded. If anything, the opposite happened. I did what I believed was right. I exposed what was happening. I helped save a company and protect the jobs of everyone working there. And 6 months later, the same company laid me off. That experience changed the way I look at things. In the real world, doing the right thing doesn't always mean you're going to be rewarded for it. Sometimes you can do everything right and still get screwed over. That's probably the hardest lesson I took from the whole experience. I don't regret stopping what was happening. I don't regret telling the founder. I don't regret preventing the company from going under. But if I could go back and make the decision again, knowing everything that would happen afterward, I honestly think I would have resigned and walked away. I had no idea when I first started digging into those financial figures that I was uncovering something that would eventually involve millions of dollars, international property, the FBI, threats, an overdose, and the collapse of the CEO's entire scheme. I was just trying to understand why the numbers didn't make sense. Instead, I found out that the company was being deliberately destroyed from the inside. And for a while, I was the person who stood in the way of it. The company survived. The employees kept their jobs. I was promoted. And then, 6 months later, COVID happened. And I was laid off. That's the part that still bothers me. Not that I did the wrong thing. I don't think I did. It's that doing the right thing doesn't necessarily protect you. Sometimes you can save everyone else and still be the one who gets left behind. I'll never really understand why that is. I worked at a grocery store where a man was murdered on aisle 8 in the freezer section, and the strangest part for me was that it happened only 2 minutes after I had left my shift for the day. I didn't know any of this was about to happen when I walked out. As far as I knew, it had just been another ordinary shift. People were shopping. Employees were doing their jobs, and customers were moving through the store like they normally did. Then, 2 minutes after I left, everything changed. There was a man shopping in the store with his family, and another guy had apparently made some inappropriate comments about the man's 14-year-old daughter. The father didn't take it well. He was angry, but he didn't immediately confront the guy. Instead, he stewed for a while. He took his groceries and brought his family out to their car. At that point, he could have left. He could have driven away with his family and never seen the other man again. But he didn't. He went back inside the grocery store. He found the man who had made the comments and confronted him. The confrontation became physical. The other guy knocked him to the ground. Then he stomped his head into the ground. He killed him. It happened on aisle 8 in the freezer section, the same grocery store where I had been working only minutes earlier. I wasn't there when it happened. I'd already left my shift for the day, and according to the timing, I had been gone for about 2 minutes when the murder occurred. That's probably the detail that makes the story stand out most to me. 2 minutes. If I'd stayed just a little longer, I could have been in that store when it happened. Instead, I had already gone home. I later found out what had happened and learned how quickly the whole situation had escalated. The man had apparently been upset by the comments about his 14-year-old daughter. Rather than immediately starting a fight, he took his groceries and got his family safely out to their car. Then he made the decision to go back inside. That part is difficult to understand. He had already gotten his family out. He could have left. Instead, he went back into the store specifically to confront the man. Whatever anger he had been sitting with apparently hadn't gone away. When he found the man, they confronted each other, and the situation became physical. The other man knocked him down, and then he stomped his head into the floor. He died there, in the freezer section on aisle 8. Afterward, someone called the police. The man who had killed him didn't try to run. He went outside. He went back to his family and said goodbye to them. He told them that he was going away for a long time. Then he waited for the police to arrive. That detail is almost as strange to me as the murder itself. He knew what he had done. He knew the police were coming. And instead of trying to escape, he went outside, said goodbye to his family, and waited. By the time I learned about it, the store where I'd just finished working had become the scene of a murder. Only minutes earlier, I had been there. People had been shopping. Employees had been working. I had finished my shift and left. Then a man was killed on aisle 8. It's strange thinking about how ordinary a place can seem right before something terrible happens. A grocery store isn't somewhere you expect to witness a murder. People are there buying food. They're pushing carts around. They're looking at prices. They're walking through aisles without thinking that something horrific could happen a few feet away. And in this case, the entire thing happened shortly after I had walked out. The freezer section on aisle 8 was just another part of the store until that day. Afterward, it was the place where a man died. I don't know exactly what happened during every second of the confrontation, and I don't want to add details that I wasn't given. What I know is that one man made inappropriate comments about another man's 14-year-old daughter. The father became angry. He took his groceries and family out to the car. Then he went back inside. He confronted the man. The confrontation turned physical. The man was knocked to the ground and had his head stomped into the floor. He died. And afterward, the person responsible went outside, said goodbye to his family, told them he was going away for a long time, and waited for the police. The whole thing happened so quickly. And for me personally, there was that strange timing. 2 minutes after I left my shift. Just 2 minutes. That's the part I still think about. You can spend hours at work and nothing unusual happens. You leave. You think your day is over. And then, minutes later, something happens in the exact place you just left that changes everything. I wasn't there to see it. I didn't hear the confrontation. I didn't see the man get knocked down. I didn't see what happened on aisle 8. But knowing that it happened only 2 minutes after I left makes it feel much closer than it otherwise would. The grocery store was somewhere I had just been. The aisle was somewhere I had probably walked through countless times. The freezer section was just another part of my workplace. Then, suddenly, someone was dead there. And the person who killed him wasn't some stranger who immediately fled. He went outside and said goodbye to his family. He knew what was coming. He told them he was going away for a long time. Then he waited for the police. I don't think I'll ever forget the fact that I left that store only 2 minutes before the murder happened. It wasn't some distant event that happened months after I stopped working there. It happened almost immediately after my shift ended. One moment, I was leaving the grocery store. 2 minutes later, a man was dead on aisle 8. And all of it started because of a comment made about someone's 14-year-old daughter. I worked at a restaurant about 10 years ago, and one of the cooks there had been with us for a long time. He had worked there for around 10 years, and everyone knew he was a heavy weed smoker. The bosses knew about it too. It wasn't exactly a secret. The reason they tolerated it was that he wasn't dealing with customers, he worked his ass off, and he was a genuinely good cook. He did his job well, and for years there hadn't really been a problem with his behavior at work. As long as he was doing his job and staying away from the customers, the bosses basically let it go. That changed when he started smoking synthetic marijuana. After that, his behavior started becoming bizarre. It wasn't just that he was acting a little different. People started noticing that something about him wasn't right. His behavior had changed, and it became harder to predict what he might do. One night, he was working during a shift when he realized he'd forgotten to leave out a case of chicken wings overnight so they could thaw. Normally, that was something that should have been dealt with ahead of time. The wings needed to be thawed, and apparently he had forgotten to take the case out. Instead of simply dealing with the situation in the normal way, he decided to try to break the frozen wings apart himself. He grabbed a butcher knife. He started using it to try to separate the frozen pieces. At some point, the knife snapped. The tip of the butcher knife broke off and ended up inside a chunk of chicken. That should have been the point where everything stopped. He had a piece of chicken with part of a knife blade embedded in it, but apparently that didn't deter him. He kept going. He eventually managed to get the wings separated. The broken piece of knife was no longer something he was apparently concerned about, and the chicken was prepared as though nothing unusual had happened. The wings were cooked. An order was made, and that order went out to a customer. That was the part that could have turned the whole situation into something much worse. A piece of a butcher knife had broken off inside one of the chicken wings, and somehow that piece had remained in the food. The food was cooked and sent out. A short while later, I got a phone call. It was from a family who had ordered the chicken. They told me that their child had bitten into one of the chicken wings and found a piece of a knife tip inside it. That was when the whole thing really sank in. A child had been eating the food. There was a piece of a broken butcher knife inside the chicken. It could have caused a serious injury. Thankfully, the child wasn't hurt. That was the biggest relief in the entire situation. The family was understandably upset, but fortunately, they were satisfied after we gave them some gift cards. Nobody had been injured. There wasn't a trip to the hospital. There wasn't a serious medical emergency. But it could have been very different. A child had bitten into a chicken wing and found a piece of a knife inside it. And the reason that happened was because a cook had broken the tip off a butcher knife while trying to separate frozen chicken wings, then continued preparing and serving the food. What made the whole thing even stranger was that he wasn't immediately fired. You would think finding a piece of a butcher knife in a customer's food would automatically mean someone was going to lose their job. But apparently, it didn't. He stayed. He wasn't fired over the chicken wing incident. The restaurant continued operating, and he continued working there. It was only a few days later that he was finally fired. The reason? He didn't show up to work. That's what ultimately got him fired. Not the knife tip. Not the fact that a child had found part of a butcher knife in their food. Not the bizarre behavior that had started after he began smoking synthetic marijuana. He was fired because he didn't show up for work. When I think back on it, that's probably one of the strangest parts of the entire story. For years, he had been considered a good employee. He had worked there for around 10 years. The bosses knew he smoked weed, but they tolerated it because he worked hard, didn't deal with customers, and was a great cook. Then he started smoking synthetic marijuana, and his behavior began changing. Eventually, he forgot to thaw a case of chicken wings. He tried to break them apart with a butcher knife. The tip of the knife snapped off inside one of the pieces. And instead of stopping, he continued. He separated the wings, cooked them, and sent an order out. A child ended up biting into one of those wings and finding the knife tip. Thankfully, the child wasn't hurt. The family accepted some gift cards and was satisfied with that. And somehow, that still wasn't enough for the restaurant to fire him. He stayed on the job for a few more days. Then, he didn't show up to work. That's when they fired him. Looking back, the whole thing is difficult to understand. The original problem was simple enough. He had forgotten to leave the chicken wings out to thaw. That's the kind of mistake that happens in a restaurant. Someone forgets something. You adjust. You find another solution. You deal with it. But instead of handling the frozen wings another way, he grabbed a butcher knife and tried to break them apart. Then the knife broke, and once the tip was inside the chicken, the situation should have been completely obvious. There was a piece of metal from a knife inside food that was going to be served to someone. At that point, the food should never have gone anywhere near a customer. But he kept working with it. He eventually separated the wings, cooked them, and sent an order out. And nobody knew what had happened until the family called. I remember getting that call because it was one of those situations where you immediately realize how close you came to something much worse. The child had actually bitten into the chicken and found the knife tip. It wasn't just a piece of something that looked strange. It was part of a butcher knife. The child was lucky. The family was lucky. And the restaurant was lucky that the outcome wasn't more serious. If the child had swallowed it, or if the piece had caused an injury, the entire situation could have been much worse. But thankfully, that didn't happen. The family was satisfied with the gift cards, and the immediate crisis ended. The cook, however, didn't lose his job over it. That's still something that stands out to me. He had been working there for roughly a decade. He was known as someone who worked hard. He was considered a great cook. The bosses had known about his marijuana use for years and had apparently decided that as long as he did his job and didn't interact with customers, it wasn't worth making an issue out of. Then his behavior changed after he started smoking synthetic marijuana, and despite that, he remained employed even after the chicken incident. It wasn't until a few days later, when he simply failed to show up for work, that the restaurant finally fired him. There's something almost absurd about the order of events. He could have seriously injured a child because a broken piece of a butcher knife ended up in a chicken wing. He wasn't fired. He missed a shift a few days later. That was what finally ended his employment. I don't know what happened to him after that. I don't know whether he stopped smoking synthetic marijuana, whether his behavior changed again, or what happened in his life afterward. I only know what happened at the restaurant. He had been there for years. He was a good cook. He worked hard. The bosses knew about his regular marijuana use and tolerated it. Then he started using synthetic marijuana, and his behavior became increasingly strange. One night, he realized he had forgotten to thaw a case of chicken wings. He grabbed a butcher knife and tried to break the frozen pieces apart. The tip of the knife snapped off inside one of the chunks. He kept going anyway. Eventually, he got the wings separated, cooked them, and sent an order out. Then I got a call from a family. Their child had bitten into a chicken wing and found the tip of the knife. Thankfully, the child wasn't hurt. The family accepted some gift cards, and that was the end of their involvement in the situation. The cook wasn't even fired. A few days later, he didn't show up for work. That was when they let him go. I think about that story every once in a while because there are so many points where things could have gone differently. The cook could have stopped when the knife broke. He could have thrown away the chicken. Someone else could have noticed the broken knife tip. The customer could have been an adult instead of a child. The child could have been injured. The family could have taken the issue much further. But none of those things happened. The child bit into the chicken, found the knife tip, and fortunately wasn't hurt. That's the part I'm most grateful for. Because when you hear about something like that, it's easy to focus on how bizarre the circumstances were. A cook who had been there for 10 years starts behaving strangely after switching from regular marijuana to synthetic marijuana. He forgets to thaw chicken. He uses a butcher knife to break it apart. The knife breaks. He continues anyway. A child finds the broken tip in their food. And the cook isn't fired until he later fails to show up for work. It's a bizarre sequence of events. But underneath all of that, there was a real possibility that a child could have been seriously injured. Thankfully, that never happened. The family was satisfied with the gift cards. The child was okay, and a few days later, the cook stopped showing up and was eventually fired. That's how the whole thing ended. Not with some dramatic confrontation, not with someone immediately being fired after the incident. Just a few days later, he didn't come to work, and that was finally enough to end it. I've worked around restaurants long enough to know that strange things happen, but this is still one of the incidents I remember most clearly. A piece of a butcher knife ended up inside a chicken wing. A child found it with their teeth, and somehow the person responsible wasn't fired for that. He was fired because he didn't show up to work a few days later. The fact that the child wasn't hurt is the only part of the story that really matters in the end. Everything else could have been much worse. Thankfully, it wasn't. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If these quiet stories help you relax or fall asleep, I'd love to have you here more often. Subscribe to Sleepy Shadows, so there's always another peaceful night waiting for you. Now, let's continue. I worked at a company where one of my long-term employees had a habit of being late. It wasn't an occasional thing, either. There always seemed to be some reason for it. Sometimes he said his neighbors had kept him up all night. Other times, he said he wasn't feeling well and was dealing with migraines. There was always some explanation for why he had arrived late, looked exhausted, or needed to apologize for being tired. Normally, I might have become suspicious after hearing the same kinds of excuses repeatedly. But in his case, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. My wife suffers from migraines, so I knew how badly they could affect someone. I also had shitty neighbors myself, so I understood that sometimes you could have your sleep completely ruined by people living around you. And this employee was good at his job. That mattered. He was one of my long-term employees, and he did his work well. He wasn't someone who was constantly causing problems or making mistakes. When he was there, he was reliable in terms of actually doing the job he was supposed to do. So when he apologized for being late, I accepted it. When he said his neighbors had kept him awake, I believed him. When he said he was suffering from migraines, I gave him some understanding. I didn't have any reason at the time to think that there was something much worse behind his exhaustion. For years, I accepted his apologies and excuses. Looking back, that's probably the part that bothers me most. Not because I think I should somehow have known what he was doing. I couldn't have known. But because all those explanations had apparently been covering something completely different. One day, he didn't show up for work at all. That was unusual enough that I tried to get hold of him. I called him, but I couldn't reach him. A couple of hours passed. Then the police showed up at my workplace. I wasn't expecting them. They told me that his place had been raided at dawn. They had arrested him. The reason was that he had been downloading and distributing child pornography. I don't think there's any way to prepare yourself to hear something like that about someone you've known and employed for years. I had spent years hearing this man's explanations for why he was tired. I'd listened to him blame his neighbors for keeping him awake. I'd listened to him say he was suffering from migraines. I'd accepted his apologies when he was late. I'd given him the benefit of the doubt because I knew that migraines could be debilitating, because I'd experienced the frustration of bad neighbors myself, and because he was good at his job. And then the police showed up and told me what he'd actually been doing. Apparently, he had been spending his nights doing that instead. He wasn't staying awake because his neighbors were keeping him up. He wasn't simply exhausted because he was dealing with migraines. He had been staying up all night downloading and distributing horrific material, then eventually turning up for work exhausted. And I'd been accepting his excuses for years. That realization was awful. Every time he'd arrived late, I had assumed there was an ordinary explanation. Every time he'd looked exhausted, I'd thought he hadn't slept because of his neighbors or because he wasn't feeling well. Every apology had seemed genuine enough. But according to what the police told me, there had been a completely different reason. He'd apparently been doing this throughout the night, and then trying to function normally at work afterward. It explained the exhaustion. It explained the lateness. It explained why someone could repeatedly show up looking like they'd barely slept. But knowing the real reason made every previous excuse feel completely different. I kept thinking about all those years, all the times I'd given him the benefit of the doubt, all the times I'd thought I was being a reasonable employer. If someone tells you they have migraines, and you know someone close to you suffers from them, you don't automatically assume they're lying. If someone says their neighbors have kept them awake all night, and you've had terrible neighbors yourself, you don't necessarily question it. And if someone is otherwise good at their job, you have even less reason to start imagining something completely unrelated and far more disturbing. That's why I never suspected anything. There was no obvious connection between his excuses and what he was actually doing. The police didn't come to tell me he'd been arrested for something minor. They told me he'd been arrested for downloading and distributing child pornography. Suddenly, the person I'd thought I knew as a long-term employee had an entirely different side to his life that I had never seen, and I had been unknowingly accommodating it. I had been giving him the benefit of the doubt. I had accepted his apologies. I had accepted his explanations. I had allowed him to continue coming in late because I believed the reasons he gave me. And the entire time, according to what the police told me, he had been using those nights for something horrific. The fact that he was good at his job made it even easier for me to overlook the pattern. If he'd been terrible at his work, constantly causing problems, or behaving suspiciously in other ways, maybe I would have paid more attention to his excuses. But he wasn't. He was good at what he did. He was a long-term employee. He had been there for years. So when he said he had been kept awake by his neighbors, I believed him. When he said he was suffering from migraines, I believed him. When he apologized for being late, I accepted it. I didn't think I was making excuses for someone who was doing something horrific. I thought I was giving a decent employee the benefit of the doubt. That's what makes the whole thing so unsettling. Sometimes you think you know why someone's behaving a certain way. You see the symptoms, and you accept the explanation that makes sense. Someone is tired because they didn't sleep. Someone is late because they were unwell. Someone looks exhausted because they've had a difficult night. You don't automatically imagine the worst possible explanation. And in this case, the worst explanation turned out to be the real one. The day the police arrived changed how I remembered all those previous incidents. Things that had seemed completely ordinary suddenly looked different. Every late arrival, every apology, every mention of his neighbors, every time he'd talked about migraines, every morning when he'd looked exhausted. I couldn't help wondering how many of those times had actually been connected to what he was doing at night. I don't know exactly how long he'd been doing it. I only know that he'd been a long-term employee and that I'd accepted his excuses for years. The police had apparently gathered enough evidence to raid his home at dawn and arrest him. And when he didn't show up for work that morning, I had no idea that the reason wasn't another excuse. I thought he might be sick. I thought maybe he was dealing with another migraine. I simply couldn't get hold of him. Then the police arrived. That's how I found out. Not from him, not from someone else at work. The police came to my workplace and told me what had happened. There was something particularly disturbing about learning it that way. I had been his employer for years. I had trusted him to do his job. I had listened to his personal explanations. And then I found out from the police that his home had been raided and that he'd been arrested for something I'd never imagined he was capable of. It made me question how well you can ever really know another person. Someone can sit across from you at work every day. They can be polite. They can be competent. They can be good at their job. They can apologize when they're late. They can give you an explanation that sounds completely reasonable, and you can believe them. Meanwhile, they may have an entire private life that you know absolutely nothing about. I don't blame myself for believing him. At least I try not to. There was no way I could have known what he was doing simply from the fact that he was sometimes late or tired. His excuses weren't impossible. They were actually very believable. My wife really does suffer from migraines. I really did have shitty neighbors. Those were real things in my own life, so when he told me similar things, I didn't have much reason to question him. And he was good at his job. That probably made me even more inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt. If someone is otherwise doing their work properly, you don't necessarily want to punish them every time they're late because of something that could genuinely be happening in their personal life. I thought I was being fair. I thought I was being understanding. I had no idea what I was actually being understanding toward. The worst part wasn't simply discovering what he'd been arrested for. It was realizing that the behavior I'd been excusing for years had apparently been connected to it. He had been staying up all night doing something horrific, and then showing up for work exhausted. And I had been listening to him explain that exhaustion away. I had effectively helped make his situation easier by believing him. Of course, I didn't know. That's the distinction I keep coming back to. I didn't know what he was doing. If I had known, I obviously wouldn't have tolerated it. There was no way for me to make that decision, because I didn't have the information. All I had were the explanations he gave me. And for years, I accepted them. Then one morning, he didn't show up. A couple of hours later, the police came to tell me why. His home had been raided at dawn. He had been arrested. And the reason was something so horrific that it completely changed how I thought about every excuse he'd ever given me. To this day, the thing that stays with me is how ordinary the warning signs looked. He was tired. He was late. He blamed his neighbors. He said he had migraines. He apologized. And because he was good at his job, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I never imagined that he was spending those nights doing something so horrific. I don't think anyone at work did. We knew the employee. We knew the version of him that came to work. We knew he was sometimes late. We knew he was tired. We knew he had explanations. But apparently, we didn't know him at all. And I certainly didn't know that when I was accepting his apologies for being exhausted, there was a completely different reason for why he hadn't slept. I wish I could say there was some obvious sign that I should have recognized. There wasn't one that I saw. There was just a long-term employee who was good at his job and occasionally late. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I accepted his apologies. I believed his excuses. And then, one morning, the police showed up and told me the truth. That was the day I realized that sometimes the explanation you accept isn't just wrong. Sometimes you don't even come close to knowing the real reason. I worked at a large mutual fund company, and there was a woman from a different department who I didn't know particularly well. I knew who she was, obviously, because we all worked in the same company, but she wasn't someone I regularly interacted with. Then she was fired. Apparently, she took it pretty badly. I don't know exactly what happened between her and the company, and I don't want to fill in details that I don't actually know. All I knew at the time was that she had been fired and was quite distraught about it. Afterward, she called her sister. Her sister lived in a different state, so she wasn't nearby, and the call was apparently just one of those conversations where she was talking about what had happened. At some point, though, the woman told her sister that she'd had a dream. She said she'd dreamed that she had killed their mother. That was obviously disturbing. But a dream is a dream. People have strange dreams all the time, and if someone is upset or emotionally overwhelmed, I suppose it's not unusual for their dreams to reflect whatever is going on in their head. The sister apparently didn't just dismiss it, though. For whatever reason, she became concerned enough to try calling their mother. She couldn't get a hold of her. Then she found out that their mother hadn't shown up for work. That was when the situation became much more serious. Her sister lived in another state and couldn't simply go over there herself. So she called the local police and asked them to do a welfare check on their mother. The police went to the house, and what they found was horrifying. There was a makeshift altar in the basement. It had teddy bears, there were lit candles, and then they found their mother. She had been encased in salt. 70 pounds of it. At that point, the police weren't just dealing with a missing or potentially endangered woman anymore. They had a murder scene. And they had another daughter who was now missing. The search was on for the woman who had made the phone call to her sister. Eventually, they found her. She was dead in her car. Apparently, she had died by suicide. So, in a very short period of time, the whole situation went from a woman being fired from her job to her sister receiving a disturbing phone call about a dream, to a welfare check, to police finding their mother dead in a basement surrounded by an altar with teddy bears and candles, and then finding the other daughter dead in her car. It was one of those stories that sounded so bizarre that, even after hearing about it, part of you almost didn't know what to do with the information. And then it got even stranger. For a while afterward, my coworkers and I would joke about it. Not because what happened was funny, obviously. It was more the kind of dark humor people sometimes use when something is so disturbing that they don't really know how else to talk about it. If one of us annoyed another person, we'd say something like, "I heard Walgreens is having a sale on salt. 70 pounds for $5. That became the joke. Someone would irritate you, and suddenly 70 pounds of salt was involved. It was horrible subject matter, but the sheer absurdity of the situation made it the kind of dark workplace joke that somehow stuck around. At the time, I remember thinking the whole story already sounded like something someone had made up. I mean, if you wrote it as fiction, you'd probably get accused of making it too ridiculous. A woman loses her job. She calls her sister and says she dreamed she killed their mother. The sister can't reach their mother. The mother hasn't gone to work. The police do a welfare check. They find a basement altar with teddy bears and candles. The mother has been encased in 70 pounds of salt. Then they search for the other daughter. They find her dead in her car. It sounds completely unbelievable. And then there was another detail. Apparently, the woman's father was already in prison for killing his second wife's mother, and he had also encased her in salt. When I first heard that, I remember thinking that there was no way this could possibly get any stranger. But apparently it did. The father had already committed a murder involving the same bizarre method. His victim had been his second wife's mother, and he'd apparently encased her in salt as well. So now there was this disturbing connection between the two generations. The daughter's mother was murdered and encased in salt. Her father was already in prison for killing his second wife's mother and encasing her in salt, and the daughter herself was then found dead after the murder of her mother. At that point, the entire thing stopped sounding like an ordinary workplace story and started sounding like something from a particularly strange crime documentary. But this was something that actually happened around people I worked with, and the fact that it involved someone from the company made it feel much closer than some random story you hear about in the news. The woman wasn't someone I knew well. She worked in a different department. She wasn't part of my daily life. I wasn't personally involved in the investigation. I didn't see the crime scene. I only knew what was being talked about afterward. But sometimes that's enough. You don't have to personally witness something for it to completely change the way you think about someone or somewhere. One day, she's just a coworker from another department who has been fired. Then you hear that she was distraught. Then you hear she called her sister and said she'd dreamed she'd killed their mother. Then the sister couldn't reach their mother. Then the police went to check on her. And suddenly you're hearing about a basement with teddy bears and candles and 70 pounds of salt. It's difficult to process something like that as a normal sequence of events, especially when you work in a large company where most people's lives are pretty ordinary. People come to work. They complain about management. They deal with deadlines. They go home. Someone gets fired and is upset about it. None of that prepares you for hearing that the same person is connected to something so horrific. And then there's the question of the dream. That was always one of the strangest parts to me. The sister only became involved because the woman called her and said she'd dreamed that she'd killed their mother. If the sister hadn't taken that seriously, would anyone have checked on the mother? Would the police have been called? Would they have found her when they did? I don't know. I can't say what would have happened. But that phone call led directly to the welfare check. And the welfare check led to the discovery of the mother. That's one of those details that sticks with you. The woman didn't apparently call her sister and say, "I killed Mom." She said she dreamed it. The sister couldn't reach their mother. Then she discovered the woman hadn't gone to work. That was enough to make her call the police, and the police found exactly what she'd been afraid of. The basement made the whole thing even more disturbing. There was a makeshift altar, teddy bears, lit candles, and the mother's body encased in salt. It's such a bizarre combination of details that it almost sounds symbolic, even though there is no explanation in what I was told for why those things were there. I don't know what the teddy bears meant. I don't know why the candles were lit. I don't know why salt was used. And I don't know whether any of it was connected to some belief or ritual, or whether there was another reason entirely. I'm not going to pretend I know. All I know is that this is what the police reportedly found. The woman who had made the phone call was then located dead in her car. Apparently it was suicide. And then came the part about the father. He was already in prison for a remarkably similar murder. His victim had been his second wife's mother, and somehow salt was involved there too. At that point, even the people telling the story had trouble believing how strange the whole thing was. I know it sounds like bullshit. That's probably the best way I can put it. If someone told me this happened to someone at their workplace, I'd probably have a hard time believing it without seeing some kind of evidence myself. There are just too many bizarre details. The dream, the missing mother, the welfare check, the basement altar, the teddy bears, the candles, the salt, the daughter's death, the father already being in prison for another murder involving salt. It sounds like somebody took several unrelated horror stories and combined them into one. But as far as I knew, this was the story surrounding someone who had worked at the same large mutual fund company as me. For years afterward, the story remained one of those things that people remembered. The dark joke about the 70 pounds of salt was part of that. If someone was being annoying, another person might jokingly mention a salt sale. It was our way of making something incredibly disturbing slightly easier to talk about. I don't think any of us ever forgot the actual seriousness of what had happened. The joke wasn't really about the victims. It was about the sheer absurdity of the detail. 70 pounds of salt. That's such an oddly specific amount that it became impossible not to remember. Although, years later, there was apparently some disagreement about the exact amount. The story had been told and retold for so long that the number changed in some accounts. I remember 70 pounds. Apparently, a news article that someone eventually found said it was 700 pounds. It's been more than 20 years, so I can't honestly swear that my memory of the number is correct. But I definitely remember 70 being the number that stuck with us. And honestly, whether it was 70 or 700, the basic story was strange enough. The thing I find most disturbing isn't even the amount of salt, it's how many warning signs appeared in retrospect. A woman was fired and was apparently extremely distressed. She called her sister. She said she'd dreamed about killing their mother. Her sister couldn't reach their mother. The mother hadn't gone to work. The police were called, and then they found her. By the time anyone outside the family understood what was happening, it was already too late. And then, the other daughter was found dead too. There wasn't some dramatic confrontation at work. There wasn't some obvious warning that made everyone realize what was coming. From the perspective of people around her, she was simply a woman who had been fired and was upset about it. Then, everything else happened somewhere completely outside the workplace. That's what made the story so unsettling to me. You can work alongside someone and know almost nothing about what is happening in their private life. You might know their department. You might know what they do. You might have seen them in the break room. You might know that they were fired. And that's it. You don't necessarily know what they're dealing with outside of work. You don't know their family history. You don't know what happened in their childhood. You don't know what is going on inside their house. And sometimes, you apparently don't know that their father is already in prison for a bizarre murder involving salt. The whole thing was so far outside anything I had ever encountered that it became one of those stories people would bring up years later. And whenever it came up, somebody would eventually make the same joke. Walgreens has a sale on salt. 70 pounds for $5. Then we'd laugh, probably because the alternative was sitting there thinking too hard about what had actually happened. I still don't know what motivated the woman. I don't know what happened in the house before the police arrived. I don't know what the altar meant. I don't know why the mother was encased in salt. I don't know why the daughter told her sister she dreamed about killing her. And I don't know what role, if any, the family's history played in what happened. Those are things I simply don't know. What I do know is that a woman from another department at the company was fired and became distraught. She called her sister in another state and told her about a dream in which she had killed their mother. Her sister couldn't reach their mother and learned that she hadn't shown up for work. She called the local police. The police went to the house. They found a makeshift altar in the basement, complete with teddy bears and lit candles. They found the mother encased in salt. The search then began for the other daughter. She was eventually found dead in her car, apparently from suicide. And somehow, the story didn't end there. Their father was already in prison for killing his second wife's mother and encasing her in salt too. That's the part that makes the entire thing sound fictional. But I remember hearing about it. I remember the jokes afterward. And I remember thinking that there was no way anyone could invent a story this strange and expect people to believe it. Unfortunately, it apparently didn't need to be invented. I worked at a nursing home kitchen for about a month back in 2017, thankfully as a temporary job while I was on summer break from university. I knew from the beginning that I wasn't going to be there permanently, and honestly, by the time that month was over, I was more than ready to go back to university. There were so many things wrong with that place, that I kept finding myself questioning my boss, who was the head cook, and the care home manager about things that just didn't seem right. Some of them were things that I noticed almost immediately. The first thing that really bothered me was how raw meat was being stored in the refrigerator. It was on the top shelf. That was obviously a problem. Raw meat was being stored above other food, which meant that if anything leaked or dripped, it could potentially contaminate whatever was underneath it. It was one of those basic food hygiene things that seemed like it shouldn't even need to be explained. I remember questioning why it was being stored that way. It wasn't the only hygiene issue, either. Some of the kitchen staff had pretty poor personal hygiene, and that was especially uncomfortable given where we were working. This wasn't just an ordinary restaurant kitchen. We were preparing food for elderly residents in a care home. These were people who could potentially be more vulnerable to foodborne illness, so basic hygiene should have been taken seriously. Instead, I kept seeing things that made me uncomfortable. One incident in particular has stayed with me. I saw one of my colleagues drop a boiled egg on the floor. It wasn't a case of the egg falling somewhere clean and being immediately replaced. It hit the floor. And then, to my absolute horror, my colleague picked it up and put it straight back on the plate. The plate was then given to a resident. I remember being horrified by that. I couldn't believe someone would actually do that. It wasn't even a situation where someone made a mistake and immediately realized what they'd done. He dropped the egg, he picked it up, and he put it back on the plate. Then, it was served. That was the kind of thing that made me wonder what else was happening when nobody was paying attention. And that was only the kitchen. There were also problems with some of the carers. One thing I always did when entering a resident's room was knock on the door. To me, that seemed like basic courtesy. These people lived there. It was their home, even if it happened to be a care home. I didn't think there was anything strange about knocking before entering someone's room. Apparently, one of the senior carers disagreed. He pulled me up about it and questioned why I was knocking on residents' doors. I told him to do one. I wasn't going to stop knocking on someone's door simply because a senior carer thought I shouldn't. Thankfully, the head cook had my back about that. That was one of the few things that made working there a little easier. My relationship with the head cook wasn't entirely bad. I had issues with some of the things happening around the place, and I questioned him about some of them. But he was generally supportive of me when it came to things like respecting the residents. Another issue I noticed involved one of the stair banisters in the dementia unit. It was loose. That immediately concerned me because the dementia unit was an area where many residents used those stairs, and a loose banister was obviously a potential safety problem. I mentioned it to the maintenance guys. I assumed that would be enough. I'd pointed out the problem. They knew about it. Surely someone would fix it. But they didn't. Nothing happened. The banister remained loose. So I went directly to the care home manager. I told her about it and demanded that something be done. At that point, I wasn't expecting an argument. I was raising a health and safety concern. There was a loose stair banister in a dementia unit used by residents, and I thought the obvious response would be to get it repaired. Instead, the manager somehow managed to turn the entire conversation around. Rather than discussing the loose banister, she started talking about me losing my job if I didn't shut up and toe the line. I remember being completely speechless. I'd gone to her because I was concerned about a potential safety hazard. Her response was essentially to threaten my employment. That was one of the moments when I really started to understand what kind of place I was working in. It wasn't just that mistakes were being made. It wasn't just that certain staff members had poor hygiene. It wasn't just that people were ignoring things they should have been fixing. There seemed to be an attitude that questioning anything was itself a problem. If you pointed something out, you were the problem. If you asked why something was being done a certain way, You were being difficult. And if you insisted that something was unsafe, you could apparently be threatened with losing your job. But there was one person there who I found even worse than the manager, the activities coordinator. She was one of the most horrible people I'd ever met. When the care home manager wasn't around, the activities coordinator was in charge. And somehow, she was even worse. What made her particularly difficult was the difference between how she treated the residents and their families and how she treated the staff. With the residents, she acted incredibly nice. With their families, she could be pleasant and friendly. But with the carers and kitchen staff, she treated people terribly. She treated them like dog shit. She also seemed to enjoy having authority over people. She would go on frequent power trips, and you never really knew when you were going to end up on the receiving end of one. I remember one particular evening shift. One of the nurses was unhappy because she thought I had served dessert portions that were too small. That wasn't really a big issue to me. If the portions were too small, fine, I offered to fix them. There was no reason for it to become an argument. I wasn't refusing to correct anything. I wasn't telling the nurse she was wrong. I simply offered to make the portions larger. The nurse wasn't having it. Instead, she got the activities coordinator involved. About 5 minutes later, I was getting an absolute dressing down from the activities coordinator, and she did it in front of all of my colleagues. I remember standing there thinking that this had gone completely beyond the original issue. The problem was supposedly that some dessert portions were too small. I had already offered to fix them, but somehow I'd ended up being publicly dressed down in front of everyone. It was humiliating, and more than that, it was exhausting. I'd already spent the previous weeks dealing with things that I thought were wrong with the care home. I'd questioned the food hygiene, I'd raised concerns about staff behavior, I'd spoken up about the loose banister, I'd pushed back when someone told me I shouldn't knock on residents' doors. And now I was being publicly humiliated over dessert portions that I had already offered to correct. I came very close to walking out. I was seriously considering just leaving, but I didn't. The main reason was that I didn't want to screw over the guys in the kitchen. They were already short-staffed as it was. Walking out would have meant leaving them with even more work during an evening shift. And despite everything that was happening, I still cared about the people I worked alongside, so I stayed. I finished the shift, but by that point, I'd made my decision. I remember thinking, I'm never coming back to this place once this shift is over. That was it. I had reached the end of my patience. I wasn't interested in going back. I wasn't interested in arguing with management anymore. I wasn't interested in trying to convince people to take basic health and safety seriously. I just wanted to finish that shift and leave. Then something happened that confirmed that I probably wasn't going to have to make that decision myself. After I'd finished work that evening, the head cook texted me. The message basically told me that, although he liked me, I wasn't welcome back at all. Apparently, I'd pissed off the higher-ups because I was talking back and being disrespectful. I can't say I was particularly surprised. By that point, I had a pretty good feeling that something like that was coming. I'd been questioning too many things. I had pushed back against people who were used to everyone simply doing what they were told. I'd raised concerns that management apparently didn't want raised, and now I was being told that my behavior had been considered disrespectful. The funny thing was that I hadn't gone into that job looking for conflict. I was there temporarily. I was working during my summer break from university. I had no long-term stake in the place. I wasn't trying to take over anything. I wasn't trying to make people's lives difficult. I was just seeing things that didn't seem right and asking questions about them. When I saw raw meat stored on the top shelf, I questioned it. When I saw someone put a boiled egg that had fallen on the floor straight back onto a resident's plate, I was horrified. When I saw a loose banister in the dementia unit, I reported it. When someone told me not to knock on residents' doors, I pushed back. And when the manager threatened my job because I wouldn't stop raising concerns, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Eventually, I went back to university and completed my degree. And honestly, leaving that place was one of the best things that could have happened. I still think about it whenever I have a bad day at my current job. Whenever work gets frustrating or something happens that annoys me, I sometimes catch myself thinking, at least I'm not at the nursing home. That's become the benchmark. No matter how bad a day at my current job gets, I can always remind myself that it isn't that place, and the story didn't end when I left. Thankfully, one of the kitchen staff I had always gotten along with eventually quit too. Not long after leaving, he reported the nursing home to the council as an anonymous whistleblower. That was when things finally started moving. The council sent an inspector to the care home. The inspector apparently noticed everything that was wrong. All the things that employees had been putting up with were suddenly being looked at by someone from outside. The hygiene problems, the safety issues, the things that management had apparently been willing to overlook. The inspector saw enough that the care home manager ended up receiving a massive fine. Somehow, though, she still kept her job. I honestly don't know how she managed that. After everything I'd seen while working there, I would have assumed that being hit with a massive fine after an inspection would have been enough to get someone removed from management. Apparently not. She stayed. And, ironically, one of the funniest things about the whole situation came later. She apparently started complaining in the town's Facebook group about being short-staffed. I remember finding that amusing. After everything that had happened, after the way staff had been treated, after the issues that had apparently been serious enough for the council to investigate and fine the care home, she was now complaining publicly that they didn't have enough staff. It was almost too perfect. I had spent that summer watching people get treated badly, watching safety concerns get dismissed, seeing questionable hygiene practices, and being told that I needed to stop talking back and simply toe the line. Then I left. Someone else eventually left too, reported the place, and the council came in and found enough problems to issue a massive fine. And the same manager was apparently still complaining about being short-staffed. I can't say I was surprised by the staffing problem. People don't tend to stay somewhere when they're treated badly. The staff were already short when I was there. I remember that being one of the reasons I didn't walk out during that evening shift when I was being dressed down in front of everyone. I didn't want to leave the kitchen staff in an even worse position. They were already struggling. And despite everything else, I didn't want my decision to walk away to make their shift harder. That's probably one of the reasons I stayed until the end that night. But I knew I wasn't coming back. The text from the head cook simply confirmed it. He told me I wasn't welcome back, apparently because I'd upset the higher-ups by talking back and being disrespectful. In a strange way, I was relieved. I had already decided I was finished with the place. I just hadn't expected to be officially told that I wasn't coming back. Looking back, that temporary job gave me a very clear idea of the kind of workplace I never wanted to be part of again. It taught me that sometimes the person raising a legitimate concern gets treated as the problem. You can point out a dangerous loose banister in a dementia unit, and instead of someone thanking you for noticing it, you can be threatened with losing your job. You can question why raw meat is stored on top of other food. You can be horrified when someone picks a boiled egg off the floor and serves it to a resident. You can simply insist on knocking before entering a resident's room. And somehow, you're the one who's being called disrespectful. I was only there for a month. That's the part I keep coming back to. 1 month. I was supposed to be working there temporarily while I was on summer break from university. I didn't even stay long enough for the place to become a major part of my life. But in that 1 month, I saw enough things that I still remember it years later. And every time I have a bad day at my current job, I think about that month. I think about the kitchen. I think about the staff. I think about the loose banister. I think about the egg that hit the floor and somehow ended up on a resident's plate. I think about being told to stop knocking on residents' doors. I think about being threatened with losing my job because I wouldn't shut up about safety. I think about the activities coordinator dressing me down in front of my colleagues over dessert portions that I had already offered to fix. And then I think about that text from the head cook telling me not to come back. And honestly, at least I'm not at the nursing home. That's still my first thought whenever work gets particularly bad. Whatever is happening at my current job, whatever frustrating thing I'm dealing with that day, I can always remind myself that I once worked in a nursing home kitchen where a loose banister in a dementia unit could be ignored. A boiled egg could fall on the floor and still be served to a resident. And raising legitimate concerns could get you threatened with losing your job. Eventually, someone else blew the whistle. The council came in, they found the problems. The manager got a massive fine, and somehow she kept her job. Meanwhile, I went back to university and finished my degree. Looking back, I'm glad I left when I did. I'm even more glad that someone eventually reported the place properly. Because the biggest thing I remember from that job isn't one single horrible incident. It's the feeling that so many things were wrong, and the people who were supposed to be responsible for fixing them seemed more interested in keeping everyone quiet than actually fixing them. I was there for 1 month. It was more than enough. I worked at a restaurant where one evening, during a dinner rush, one of the servers dropped a glass near the kitchen. Normally, when a glass breaks, it's not particularly dramatic. It hits the floor, breaks into a few pieces, and you clean it up. This one was completely different. The glass absolutely exploded. Shards went flying everywhere. It was almost impressive how spectacularly this little shot glass managed to break. Instead of just dropping and cracking on the floor, it sent pieces of glass in all directions. Obviously, everyone immediately started cleaning it up. We picked up everything we could see and cleaned the area as thoroughly as possible. But when you're in the middle of a dinner rush, you don't have the luxury of stopping everything and spending an unlimited amount of time checking every possible place a piece of glass could have gone. There was a standard procedure for broken glass, though. If glass breaks anywhere near food or ice, you're supposed to clear everything out and replace or refill it. The reason is pretty obvious. You can't always see every piece of glass. Even if you clean the area and don't see anything near the food, a tiny shard can end up somewhere you wouldn't expect. So the safest thing is to throw out anything that could have been contaminated and replace it. During a busy dinner rush, though, doing that can be extremely difficult. If you completely clear the line of everything that might have been exposed and then have to replace and refill everything, you're basically restarting the entire operation while customers are waiting for their food. That night, we didn't see any glass land near the food. We checked the area as best we could. The ice was close enough to the broken glass that we cleared it out and replaced it because we weren't going to take a chance with that. But as far as the food was concerned, we didn't see any glass near it. We were told it was okay. So we continued working. The dinner rush continued. Orders kept coming in. The kitchen kept putting food out. And as far as we knew, the broken glass incident was over. We had cleaned it up. We had replaced the ice. We hadn't seen anything fall into the food. Everything seemed fine. Later that evening, one of the servers came back to the manager. There was a guest who had been injured. The guest had been eating mashed potatoes when he bit into something hard. It turned out to be a piece of sharp glass. He had sliced his tongue open. That's when the whole situation suddenly made sense. A piece of that glass had somehow ended up in the mashed potatoes. We hadn't seen it. Nobody had noticed it during the cleanup. Nobody had seen a shard land anywhere near the food. But somehow a piece of that shot glass had made its way into the potatoes, and the guest found it with his mouth. It was absolutely wild. The exact reason the restaurant's procedure required us to clear everything out and replace it whenever glass broke near food was because of exactly this kind of worst-case scenario. It wasn't just some theoretical rule. It wasn't there because management wanted to make everyone's job harder during a dinner rush. It was there because tiny pieces of glass can go places you can't see. That night we thought we'd cleaned everything up. We didn't see any glass near the food. We replaced the ice because it had been nearby. But we didn't clear and replace everything. And then a guest bit into mashed potatoes and got a piece of sharp glass in his mouth. He ended up cutting his tongue. The part that really bothered me was how easily it could have been missed. Glass isn't always obvious once it breaks. A tiny piece can blend into food. It can land somewhere you aren't looking. It can get moved around without anyone realizing it. And in this case, that's apparently what happened. We had looked around. We had cleaned up what we could see. There was no obvious piece of glass sitting in the mashed potatoes. But that didn't mean there wasn't one there. The guest had no way of knowing either. He was just eating his dinner. He wasn't doing anything unusual. He took a bite of mashed potatoes and ended up with a sharp piece of glass in his mouth. The injury could have been much worse. Thankfully, as far as I knew, he sliced his tongue rather than suffering something even more serious. But even that was bad enough. It was a piece of glass, inside food, and he had bitten directly into it. The incident was basically a real-life example of why the procedure existed in the first place. If glass breaks near food or ice, everything is supposed to be removed and replaced. That's the rule. The reason is that you can never be completely certain you've found every piece, and we learned that lesson the hard way. We had been in the middle of a dinner rush, and clearing the entire line would have been a nightmare. There was food that needed to be replaced. Things needed to be refilled. Orders were coming in. Customers were waiting. So when we didn't see any glass near the food, it was tempting to believe that everything was fine. And for a while, it seemed like it was. Then the server came back and told the manager about the guest. He had bitten into his mashed potatoes and found a sharp piece of glass. It was one of those moments where the situation immediately goes from being a minor workplace cleanup to something much more serious. We hadn't just broken a glass. A customer had been injured because of it. And the worst part was that the glass had gotten into food, despite the fact that we had looked for it. That was the whole point of the procedure. You don't rely on being able to see every piece. You assume there could be pieces you can't see and remove the potentially contaminated food anyway. That night, we hadn't done that. We had cleared the ice because we knew it was close, but we didn't clear everything else, and somehow a piece of glass ended up in the mashed potatoes. I don't know exactly how the shard got there. I don't know whether it traveled farther than we expected when the glass exploded, or whether it somehow ended up there during the cleanup. I don't want to invent an explanation that I don't actually know. All I know is that we didn't see it. The guest did. Unfortunately, he found it by biting into it. It was goddamn wild. You can have procedures in place for a reason, and sometimes it takes one incident for everyone to understand exactly why they're there. Before that happened, the rule about clearing food after broken glass might have felt like an annoying restaurant procedure during a busy shift. When you're slammed with orders and someone breaks a glass, the last thing you want to hear is that you have to throw out a bunch of food and start replacing everything. But after someone gets a piece of glass in their food, the rule doesn't seem excessive anymore. It makes perfect sense, because it only takes one tiny shard. The restaurant can clean the floor. Employees can look around. Everyone can be completely convinced that they got everything, and there can still be one piece somewhere nobody noticed. In this case, that one piece ended up in a customer's mashed potatoes. He bit into it. It cut his tongue. And suddenly the dinner rush wasn't the biggest concern anymore. The restaurant had a customer who had been injured by something that never should have been in his food. As far as I heard, the customer was considering suing. I don't know what happened after that. I never heard anything about the outcome. I don't know whether he actually filed a lawsuit, whether there was a settlement, or whether nothing ultimately came of it. That part of the story is unknown to me. What I do know is what happened that night. A server dropped a shot glass near the kitchen. It shattered far more violently than anyone expected. Glass went everywhere. We cleaned up what we could see. We replaced the ice because it had been close to the broken glass. We didn't see anything land near the food, so we didn't completely clear and replace everything. We were in the middle of a dinner rush, and we thought we'd handled it. Then a customer bit into his mashed potatoes and found a sharp piece of glass. He sliced his tongue. And the exact procedure we'd been trying to avoid following, because of how disruptive it would have been, was the procedure that existed specifically to prevent something like this from happening. That's the part I remember most. The rules suddenly made perfect sense. You don't clear everything because you expect someone to get hurt every time a glass breaks. You do it because you can't guarantee that you found every piece. That night, we thought we'd gotten most of it. We were wrong, and one tiny piece of glass was enough to turn a normal dinner into a trip to the doctor, a serious complaint, and potentially a lawsuit. I never heard what happened with the lawsuit, but I never forgot the lesson. When glass breaks near food, you really do need to assume that there could be a piece you can't see. I worked at FedEx for exactly one day. The interview and training process itself was pretty unremarkable. There wasn't anything particularly unusual about it. The training mostly focused on the usual company policies, along with a lot of talk about the evils of unions. It was basically the usual corporate propaganda. After that, we spent about 2 hours watching videos about the safety regulations we were expected to follow while working there. That part was actually pretty thorough. We were shown the procedures and told what we were supposed to do to keep ourselves safe. There were rules about how the trucks were supposed to be unloaded, how many people were supposed to be assigned to each truck, and how the work was meant to be organized. One of those safety rules was particularly straightforward. Every truck was supposed to have 3 people assigned to it. 2 people were supposed to unload the truck. The third person was responsible for checking the packages and marking them for sorting. That was how the process was supposed to work. 2 people doing the physical unloading meant that neither person was supposed to be handling the heavier packages completely alone. The third person could concentrate on checking and marking packages rather than having to constantly switch between jobs. It all seemed reasonable. Then, after about 2 hours of watching safety videos, they finally took me out onto the floor. That was my first day actually unloading trucks. I was assigned to a truck with 2 other people. At least, that's how it started. About 10 minutes into the shift, my second unloader disappeared. I didn't really understand what was happening at first. 1 minute there were 3 of us. Then a supervisor came over and took the sorter away from our truck. The supervisor told me that the packages from my truck would be sorted farther down the belt. And then they left. So suddenly, I was standing there by myself. The other unloader was gone. The sorter was gone. And I was left with the entire truck, by myself. It was an 18-wheeler, not a small delivery van, not a handful of boxes. An entire 18-wheeler full of packages that I was now expected to unload alone. The strange thing was that we'd just spent 2 hours being shown safety videos that explained why this wasn't supposed to happen. I'd literally been told that the truck was supposed to have 3 people assigned to it. 2 unloaders, 1 sorter. Then, almost immediately after the training ended, 2 of those 3 people were removed, and I was left alone. At first, I figured someone would come back. Maybe the supervisor was only moving people around temporarily. Maybe another worker was going to be assigned to the truck. Maybe someone had simply made a mistake. So I started working. For the first hour or so, I managed reasonably well. I tried to make things easier on myself by taking the lightest packages first. Whenever I came across something heavy, I'd leave it for later. I kept thinking that somebody was going to show up eventually. I was new. This was my first day. Surely somebody would notice that one person was unloading an entire 18-wheeler alone and send someone over. So I kept going. I moved the lighter boxes. I tried to work efficiently. And I kept hoping that someone would eventually come help me. Then another hour passed. By that point, I wasn't dealing with just light packages anymore. The heavier ones were still there, and there was nobody coming. Eventually, I was having to deadlift packages weighing somewhere between 75 and 100 pounds out of the truck by myself. These weren't packages I could comfortably pick up and carry around. I was lifting them out of the truck because there was nobody else there to help. The job was becoming exactly the kind of situation we'd been warned about in the safety training. Except now, I was the person being put into it. I kept working because I didn't really know what else to do. I was new. I didn't want to cause problems on my first day. And I still believed someone was eventually going to realize what was happening. There was also the pressure that comes with being the new person. You don't necessarily want to be the one who immediately starts arguing with a supervisor. You don't know the workplace yet. You don't know how things are normally handled. You don't know which rules are actually enforced and which ones are treated as suggestions. But we'd just been told that this was a safety requirement. 3 people to a truck, 2 unloading, 1 sorting, and now I was doing the work alone. The longer it went on, the more exhausted I became. Still, I kept going. Then came the last hour of the shift. My supervisor finally came back. Apparently, they had noticed that the truck wasn't being unloaded quickly enough. That was the reason they came looking for me. Not because someone had noticed that I'd been working alone for hours, not because someone had noticed that I was handling packages that were supposed to be handled by 2 people. They came back because the truck wasn't being unloaded fast enough. By then, I was already struggling. And then everything went wrong. I ended up pinned underneath about 200 pounds of furniture. I couldn't get myself free. 2 other unloaders had to be called over to get me out. I was injured. And somehow, after all of that, I was reprimanded for not having a second lifter with me. I remember how ridiculous that was. I had been left alone. The supervisor had removed the other 2 workers from my truck. I'd spent hours unloading the 18-wheeler by myself, and when I finally got hurt under a massive piece of furniture, the response was to tell me that I should have had another person helping me lift it. Of course I should have. That was exactly the rule we'd been taught. That's why there were supposed to be 2 unloaders. But the second unloader wasn't there because a supervisor had taken them away, and the sorter wasn't there because the supervisor had taken them away too. I hadn't decided to ignore the safety procedure. The safety procedure had effectively been removed from my truck. Then I was blamed for the consequences. I ended up needing 2 weeks of rest. There was also a short investigation and a workers' compensation filing. Eventually, the supervisor was forced to acknowledge what had actually happened. They had been responsible for removing the 2 other workers from my truck. So the same person who had taken away the workers I was supposed to have with me was eventually forced to acknowledge that they'd been responsible for putting me in that situation. By that point, I'd already seen enough. I'd been hired. I'd gone through the training. I'd watched hours of safety videos. I'd been told exactly how many people were supposed to be assigned to a truck. Then, I'd been sent into a situation where those safety procedures weren't followed. I'd been left to unload an entire 18-wheeler by myself. I'd been lifting 75 to 100-pound packages alone. And I'd eventually been pinned underneath roughly 200 pounds of furniture. Then, I'd been reprimanded for not having a second person there. After the investigation and the workers' compensation filing, they eventually asked me when they could expect me back to work. I told them to shove it. I'd only worked there for 1 day. 1 day was enough. The thing that still bothers me isn't just that I got injured. It's that the injury happened in a situation the company had specifically told us was unsafe. They knew the truck was supposed to have 3 people. They knew 2 people were supposed to unload. They knew another person was supposed to handle the sorting. Those weren't things I invented afterward to justify what happened. Those were the rules they had just spent 2 hours teaching us. And then, on my first day actually doing the job, those rules disappeared. Years later, I still have problems with my back. There's a spot about the diameter of a soda can where my back still feels like pins and needles. I can still feel it. It's been years, and that sensation never completely went away. Whenever I think about that first day, I keep coming back to how quickly the whole thing happened. 2 hours of safety training, 10 minutes on the floor. Then the people I was supposed to work with were removed. I spent hours doing the work alone. Then I got hurt. And afterward I was told I should have had someone helping me. I should have. That's the whole point. There was supposed to be someone there. In fact, there were supposed to be 2 other people there. But I wasn't the one who removed them. I was just the new guy who followed the instructions I was given and tried to get through his first shift. I didn't know how the workplace operated yet. I didn't know whether this was normal. I didn't know whether supervisors routinely moved people around. I didn't know whether I was supposed to refuse. I just knew I had been given a job to do. So I did it, and I trusted that the people supervising me knew what they were doing. That trust lasted about 1 day. The irony is that the safety training had actually made the whole thing more frustrating. If they hadn't spent 2 hours explaining the safety rules, I might have assumed that working alone was simply how the job worked. But they had specifically told us otherwise. They had explained why the truck needed 3 people. They had shown us the procedures. They had told us what we were expected to do. Then, almost immediately, the actual workplace contradicted everything we'd just been taught. And when I was injured, the blame initially went in the exact opposite direction. Instead of asking why I had been left alone, I was told that I should have had another lifter. Eventually, the investigation established that the supervisor had been responsible for removing the other workers. That at least confirmed what I already knew. I hadn't simply wandered off and decided to unload the truck alone. I hadn't ignored the safety rules. The workers who were supposed to be there had been taken away. And then the company expected the truck to keep moving. I was the one left standing inside it. I was the one lifting the heavy packages. And I was the one who ended up underneath the furniture. The whole experience changed the way I look at workplace safety. It's easy to sit through a training video and hear a list of rules. 3 people to a truck, 2 unloaders, 1 sorter. Always use proper lifting procedures. Follow the safety regulations, and so on. It all sounds very official, but those rules only matter if the people running the workplace actually enforce them. Otherwise, they're just words on a screen. I learned that on my first day, and I learned it the hard way. I never went back. They asked when they could expect me to return, and I told them to shove it. I had already spent enough time dealing with an employer that could teach me 1 set of rules for 2 hours and then ignore those same rules once I was actually on the floor. The injury stayed with me, though. Years later, I still have back problems. There's still that small area on my back, roughly the diameter of a soda can, where it feels like pins and needles. One day at FedEx. That's all it took. One day of work. One truck. One supervisor deciding they needed people somewhere else. And one employee left alone with hundreds of pounds of packages. The safety rules were there. The training was there. The procedure was there. What wasn't there was anyone making sure those rules were actually followed. If you're still here, thank you for spending part of your night with me. I hope these stories helped your mind slow down, even if they left a few questions behind. Sleep well, and I'll meet you again, here in the shadows. Good night.